Good morning. This is a recording for the last unit of our AP Biology curriculum, and it's about ecology. I'll be dividing the PowerPoint presentation into several small recordings to facilitate the process of uploading. Okay, so first of all, what is ecology? Of course, I know that you have a good deal of information about ecology. We are just reviewing the main concepts you might have covered in environmental sciences, and at the same time, make sure that you've covered all what is necessary for your AP biology final official test. So ecology is the study of interactions, and these interactions are between living organisms and other living organisms, or living organisms and their environment. So the golden or the key word for ecology is interactions. So you have interactions of living organisms either with other living organisms or with the environment around them, of course, their own environment. Okay? So this is the definition of ecology. The definition of a population. A population, of course, as you know, are a group of individuals. So it's a group of individuals. You should have many individuals, and they live in one area. So we can say, for example, the population of French people living in Maadi, for example. So they are a group of individuals that live in one area, or for example, the population of monkeys, for example, in the zoo, or a population of lions in the zoo. So it is a group of individuals of one species. They have to belong to one species, and they live in one area, and they have the ability of interbreeding. Of course, since they belong to the same species, then they can interbreed, because if they can't interbreed and there is reproductive isolation, they cannot be considered belonging to the same species. So they are able to interbreed and to interact. Whereas a community is bigger or more inclusive than a population, because the community involves or includes all the organisms that live in one area. For example, if this surface area represents Maadi, where I live, so if we consider, for example, humans, and if we consider cats, dogs, maybe some insects, for example, maybe also like mosquitoes or houseflies, for example, or some rodents like mice, or some, for example, other living organisms, then all this represents a community. So of course, a community, as you see, includes population of human beings, the population of dogs, the population of cats, the population of insects, the population of mice, but in a certain area. You have to determine the area where you have to determine this community lives in which area. And then we have the ecosystem. Again, we have a given area, ecosystem. Again, we have a certain area, and the ecosystem includes all living organisms that live in that area, in addition to non-living factors, or what we call abiotic factors. You know that biotic means alive. Abiotic, when we put a at the beginning, this means non-living. Like, for example, sunlight. Like examples of non-living abiotic factors include the soil, the rocks, wind, sunlight, water, and even temperature is considered an abiotic factor. When you talk about the global ecosystem in the whole, for example, if you talk about the whole Earth and the atmosphere around the Earth, then you're talking about the biosphere. You're talking about the global ecosystem. So now, for example, these are pictures that give you the difference between a population. For example, you have to specify. So, for example, in order to be accurately describing a population, you would say a population of, for example, penguins, the population, because we are, why the? Because we are going to specify the area. For example, the population of penguins in for example, North America. I don't know where exactly they live, but they live in cold areas, okay? Here, for example, we have a community. Now, the community includes all types of living organisms in a particular area. So first of all, you define the area, and then we have this community includes what? This community includes flowers. This community includes snails. This community includes insects. This community includes birds. And for example, they are present in the Egyptian zoo, for example, or in a particular forest that you can name. For example, here we have the ecosystem, and the ecosystem includes, when we talk about community, we still talk living organisms. So when you talk population, you talk living organisms. When you talk community, you talk living organisms. But when you talk ecosystem, you talk living organisms plus non-living organisms. So here we included, for example, the sky with the clouds. We included the water, we included the soil and grass. So you have all kinds of biotic and abiotic factors. So the ecosystem includes all biotic and abiotic factors, and again, in a particular place. Okay, so again, you have to specify the area. So it has to be a well-defined area, and you name the area. Now, what are the properties of a population? First of all, the size. Of course, this is easy to remember because N denotes the number. So when we say the size of the population, for example, we can say that the population of dogs, for example, the population of dogs in Egypt, for example, we specify the area, however big or small that area is, equals, for example, 1 million dogs. I don't know, of course, the exact number, but you have to specify the area and you have to specify a certain absolute number. And you needn't talk about the density because here you're talking about the number that is present in a particular area. But when we talk about the density, we have to specify where this number you are talking about, in which area or how much area it occupies or how much volume it occupies. So if you're talking, for example, about the density of bacteria, you can say, for example, that we have 1,000 bacteria, 1,000 bacteria per cubic millimeter of pond water. So here you not only had you defined the number of bacteria, but you also defined the volume. So the density is the number either per unit area, if you're talking about an area, or per unit volume, if you're talking about a volume. Of course, in order for you to count the number of organisms in a particular area, this is extremely hectic. For example, if you want to determine the number of lions in a forest, this would be extremely difficult. So counting the number of organisms inhabiting a certain area is almost impossible. So you're talking about mission impossible. But scientists refer to other techniques in order to estimate the number of organisms in a particular area. So what about the density? It's totally okay. Since we determine the number, in a particular area, then afterwards, once we get the number, so this will be experimentally determined, and then the area, of course, can be measured. The area, of course, can be measured, and then at that time, when we have both, we can divide the number by the area and we get the density. So how do scientists do this? Of course, the area will be known. The area of a particular place they are considering will be known, and they have to determine the number. So they use a technique that is called mark and recapture. Mark and recapture. Meaning, for example, that if we are talking about a population of lions, if you are talking about a population of lions in a forest of known area, in a forest that has, for example, boundaries, so that the area is well determined, and you're going to catch a certain number of lions. If it's possible, of course, to catch a lion. Let's take another more possible animal to catch a certain number of the animals that you want, whose number you want to determine, catch a certain number, and then you mark them. Say, for example, that you marked 50 lions or 50 of that animal. Okay, and then what you do is that after having captured the animal and mark it or tag it, you can say tag it, then you release it. Then you release those lines that you had already captured and marked. So when you release them, they will be diluted by the population of lions. Their number will be diluted by the population. Their number will be diluted by the other lines that are not marked. And then you recatch a sample. And you see how many marked lines are present in the second recatch, and you substitute in that equation. For example, suppose that the number of lines that have been marked in the first catch, as we said, was 50, and then the total number in the second catch was 1000. Okay, and of course, the number of recaptures in the second catch, of course, we are talking about the number of recaptures here, means the tagged ones. Of course, it will be much smaller than 50. How much smaller would it be? This depends on how big the population is. So the number of recaptures is definitely smaller than the number of the first captures, the labeled ones at the beginning. Okay, so the big question is, and this would make you understand why the equation is formulated like this: how much smaller? If I ever ask you, how much smaller is it? You would say it depends, of course, on how big the population is. And if we want to formulate the relationship, we would say the following. The bigger the general population, marked and unmarked, the bigger the general population, the more the dilution to the numbers of tagged lions, and the smaller the number of recaptures. So the final relationship would be an inverse relationship. The smaller the number of recaptures. So if we say, for example, 50 here, and then we say 1,000, 1,000 is not the total number of the population. 1,000 is the number of recaptures. And then we found that the number of recaptures in the second catch was only 10. Then the total number of the population is 50,000 divided by 10. And therefore, the total number of the population of lions is 5,000. Okay. Now, what are the properties of a population? Here, for example, this is exactly what we said before. Here, we say how to calculate the population density. There are 50 zebra mussels that are captured, marked, and released. And then 1 week later, we recapture. So here we would say recapture 100 zebra, and only 10 are found to have markings already. So the total number is 500. Of course, this is not. So the title here is incorrect. So it is how to calculate population number. If you want to calculate population density, you have to divide by the surface area. Now, again, other than the number of the individuals in a population and the density of a population, the third property is the dispersion of the population. And by dispersion here, we mean the pattern of distribution of the individuals within, again, the particular area where the population lives or that the population inhabits. And by pattern of spacing of individuals, when we see how much the individuals are spaced, then we're talking about the distribution of those individuals. So we can say that the dispersion is the pattern of distribution of the individuals within the area inhabited, which is, of course, related to the pattern of spacing of those individuals. And here we have three types of dispersion. We have the clumped dispersion, where the organisms are present in groups. Like, for example, when fish travel in water, they travel, their pattern of distribution in the water is characterized mostly by being a clumped dispersion type, because this traveling in small groups gives them more safety. They don't want to travel individually because they would be exposed to predators or to bigger fish, and they don't want to be, again, grouped in one big major group, because if there is any environmental change, they will all perish. So they prefer to travel in small groups, which we call clumped dispersion. The uniform pattern is when, for example, you find in a particular forest, for example, wild trees that are not cultivated by human beings and that are equally spaced. So we have regular spaces between the plants, and this is because these plants usually secrete chemicals that keep away other plants. In order, why are they doing this, and how are they doing this? First of all, they secrete chemicals. Those chemicals, when they are secreted by the plants in the soil, of course, by the lowermost part of the plant, they reach the soil and they diffuse to a certain area. In all this area where the toxin has diffused, no tree, no seeds can germinate into a big tree. And then in that area, the chemical did not arrive here by diffusion, so the seeds have developed into a tree. So by doing this, they are making sure that any plant that will succeed to grow, any seed that will succeed to germinate and form a small plant and then a big plant and a tree, will be away enough, or will be far enough from the original plant in order not to compete for the resources. And subhanallah, yani these are types of adaptation of plants when there are limited resources. So when the plants grow in soils or environments where there are limited resources, they try as much as they can to avoid competition by secreting toxins that diffuse to a certain space And in all this area where the toxin has diffused, no plant can grow. And this ensures, of course, regular spacing. Why is it regular? Because it seems that since all these plants belong to the same species, then they secrete the same concentration and amount of the toxin that diffuses in the same soil to the same distance. And then we have random spaces. Here we had like factors that favored clumping. So here there were factors that favored clumping, and those factors were mainly being exposed to danger. Here we had factors that favor spacing, and these factors were the limited resources. When you have neither of this, you have neither factors that favor clumping nor factors that favor spacing. So it is random distribution or random spacing. So random spacing occurs in the absence of any special reason for attraction or special reason for repulsion. Of course, here, when we talk about clumping, we talk about reasons for attraction. And when we talk about spacing, then we talk about forces that favor repulsion. Okay, and this occurs usually randomly in forests. So here, for example, you have regular dispersion. Here you have clumped or aggregated dispersion. Yes, clumped dispersion. We usually call it clumped dispersion. And here you have random dispersion. And now we are going to talk about the survivorship curves or the mortality curves. You can call them survivorship curves or mortality curves. You can see, for example, here on the x-axis, you have the age and on the age group, and on the y, of course, age here is time, and therefore it's a continuous independent variable. And that's why we can use a line curve or a line graph. So time is a continuous variable, and it is the independent variable. So here, and this is a line graph, as you know, this is a line graph. Notice how you can draw a good curve or a good graph, sorry, by having a title, okay, by labeling the y-axis, and if there is a unit, you put a unit, but here it's a percentage, so it's a ratio. And here, for example, we can say age in years or age in days or age in month, depending on what? Depending on the type of the organism and the length of the life cycle of the organism. And depending on your goal, for example, if you're talking about the survivorship curve of newborns, for example, you would put the age in month or maybe in days. But if you're talking about the survivorship curves of adult individuals, of grown-ups, then you would put the unit in years. And then, for example, we have here like 5 line graphs. We have A, B, C, D, and E. And of course, it's obvious that the graphs will differ according to the type of organisms. The survival is the dependent variable, of course. Okay, of course, in curve A, in curves A and B, it's obvious that here we have 100%, meaning that here we have the whole population. So here, for example, if you have fish eggs, for example, that hatch in water, you will find that very rapidly, at a very early age, almost all the population will perish, meaning that if you have a small fish that live in a dangerous area over a short period of time, they would either migrate and go elsewhere, or they would, if you're talking about survival in particular, they would perish. But here, for example, we can see that by the time this first population A has perished, the population D is still almost 100% of the individuals are present, and then they start to decline over a short period of time. Of course, this depends upon how developed the organism is, how protected the organism is, what environmental dangers and selective positive or negative pressures the organism is exposed to. This was a brief idea, but we're going to see the details on the following slides. In survivorship curves or the mortality curve, we have three types of curves. But first, let's define what a survivorship curve or mortality curve tells you. It shows you the size and the composition of the population, meaning that at any time, let's erase. For example, if we say that the age here, for example, if we say that the age here is 80 years, if we're talking, for example, about human beings, then during all this period, 100% of the organisms were present, meaning that, or almost 100, meaning that the population will be made mainly of young people and average aged people. Of course, we cannot say that this graph belongs to human beings in general. You have to specify, because there are communities that are well developed where people can stay alive, or most people can stay alive until, for example, 70 years of age, and then they start having cancer or diseases that make them pass away. But if you talk about, for example, an underdeveloped community where we have many diseases, where we have many wars or many earthquakes and volcanoes, then the condition would be different. So we will be seeing all this in detail on the following graphs. So type 1, so that's why I went back to the previous graph to tell you the composition of a population. The composition of the population, meaning, for example, how much percent of the population are under 20, for example, under 20 years of age. How much percent of the population are between 20 and 40? How much are between 40 and 60, and so on, because you will see that this will differ from one type of survivorship curves to another, from one type of communities to another. So they show both the size and composition of the population. In type 1, you have organisms with a low death rates in young age and in middle age, and then they have a high mortality rate in old age. And this is because, why do we have a low death rate in young and middle age? Because we have a great deal of parenting that accounts for this high survival rate, and the best example is the human beings. As I told you, for example, we can consider that this one is similar to the survivorship curves of human beings, where during young age and during middle age, you have a high survival rate because of a great degree of parenting, and then in old age, there is decline because of diseases. Of course, there might be differences between human populations. For example, if you have a more developed country where, for example, we have a good deal of health care and people are well educated, they are aware of how to take care of their health, then we might have, even in old age, a high survival rate. Type 1, of course, the prototype is the human beings. In type 2, we have a constant death rate over lifespan. It might be a high death rate or a low death rate, but it is a constant death rate over lifespan. And therefore, if we say, for example, that this is the 100, if they have a constant death rate of 10%, for example, then we will have all over, or all throughout their life, we will find that we will have 90% of the original size of the population is there until they all of a sudden die. And then we have type 3, where we have a very high death rate among the young. And those death rates then will decline for those survivors that reach a certain age. And the best example are the fish and the invertebrates. Why? Because at the beginning, as I told you, they release a big number of eggs. And when they release a big number of eggs, they cannot protect all this huge number of eggs. In addition to the environmental harsh environmental factors or harsh environment. For example, we might have water currents. For example, we might have bigger fish that devour them. And then after this, the fertilization is external, meaning that there is no protection for the embryo. This is the second factor for the fertilized egg. Unlike, for example, in human beings, where the fertilized egg is protected in the amniotic sac, and there is no parenting. For example, the mother fish will not take care of the eggs. It's almost mission impossible. So at the beginning, for example, we can say that this one represents the mortality curve of the fish. At the beginning, as you see, there is a big decline in the number. In the early stages of life, there is a rapid, very rapid actually, it's a steep curve downward, it's a steep negative curve. So there is a very rapid decline at the beginning. And then afterward, those who survive will have a lower death rate, but for the survivors only. Those that succeed in survival will have a lower death rate afterward for the survivors. This one might represent the type 2 that we talked about. For example, for hydroreptiles and rodents, or it might represent the mortality curve for human beings in very developed countries where people really stay until very old ages, unaffected, almost unaffected by diseases, unless there is an emergent disease like cancer or an emergent incident like accidents, for example. There is another way to represent what we have talked about, the mortality rate of the individuals, the survival rate of the individuals, and to compare the developed and underdeveloped countries, and to develop the different types of populations, less complex, more complex, or species. And it is the age structure diagrams. And the age structure diagrams are another way of representing the parameters of the population, meaning that it represents the size of the population, it represents the composition of the population, as we said before, how much are young, how much are in the middle age, how much are in the old age or in a certain age range, and it also represents the death and survival rates. So these are some of the parameters of the population, and they show the relative numbers of individuals at each age group. We have, when we draw the age structure diagrams like those ones, if you learn how to interpret them, then at the very first look you can deduce what, you cannot of course deduce which country in particular you're talking about, or we are representing, but you can just deduce whether this country is underdeveloped or a well-developed country. So we actually have two shapes. We have a very characteristic pyramidal shape, like for example in Mexico, pyramidal shape, and the prototype here in this diagram is Mexico. But notice, of course, that these representations might change over time because some underdeveloped communities become more developed or less developed. So this is changeable. And then we have, so the pyramidal shape like in Mexico, and we have the zero population growth, for example, like in Sweden or in the United States. So we have here the zero population growth. Okay, and here again, we have the zero population growth. Let's see when countries are represented by this pyramidal age structure diagrams, what does this mean? What does this imply or reflect? And similarly, the zero population growth diagrams. When you have the pyramidal shape, like in Mexico or in Egypt, for example, this means that you have a developing nation. And that the composition, this is what I was talking about a few minutes ago, that the composition of the population is in favor of young people. So you will find, for example, that half the population is under the age of 20. Why? Because they give a big number of offspring, they do not apply contraceptive measures, and they love to have big families and a big number of offspring. And even after having taken into account diseases or natural disasters or emigration that occurs, the population under 20 years of age will be an enormous population. So here, the percentage, you have to notice this. This is a very important difference between age structure diagrams and between the survivorship curves that we have just studied, that here the percentage of population is on the x-axis. So here your independent variable is the percentage of population. This is one thing. The other thing is that in order to have an indicative representation that is easy to interpret, we put the zero in the middle, and we have like a mirror image on both sides, but actually it's not a mirror image. We are splitting the x-axis into two halves. To the right, you will have the female, and to the left, you have the male composition. So it's not actually a mirror image because females and males do not necessarily have the same number in each age group. So if we try to interpret this age structure diagram of Mexico, for example, so we will find, for example, that here, this distance is about 7% of the population. So those pink areas represent a percentage that is 7% of the population, or 6.5. So what age groups are these? You have to go to the left. So of course, ignore now this age structure diagram. So you will find that under 5, you have 7%. From 5 to 9, you also have about 7%. From 10 to 14, you have this. So this is 6%. Okay, so you can say, for example, that if each of these intervals represents 7%, so the total percentage for these three age intervals would be 21%. And this is what we have just said, that about 20% of the population are under 14 years of age. Okay, thank you guys, and I'll be continuing on another video.